Welcome to the Michigan Football Junkies podcast. I'm Jeremy Miller. Today we're going to get into the Michigan State preview. You know, this is a big week for us. We've got this monkey on our back. Michigan State is not the better team, nor have they been in many of these other years, but yet they've still got the win because Michigan State just wanted it more. That's just a flat-out reality. They wanted it more. But I don't think that's the case anymore. Michigan's emphasized the Michigan State game. Not only that, you can see how much these players want it. After the Penn State game, they're walking down the tunnel already talking about the Michigan State game. It's not, hey, yeah, we're celebrating this Penn State victory. Yeah. No. They're talking about Michigan State already. We want Paul back. That's been the talk the entire time. They got to get Paul back. Now, we have some things that Michigan State, I think, is going to try and do their best to shut down the run and say, hey, JJ, you have to beat us. I don't think that's going to be a problem. Michigan State's secondary is just not good. And I think people underestimate how good J.J. McCarthy is. I mean, you're still talking about, is he still leading the entire country in completion percentage, I believe? He's been phenomenal this whole year. Now, he's made a few mistakes, but he learns from them. So I really don't think Michigan State is going to do well trying to make J.J. McCarthy beat you. He's going to still do it. And that's the sentiment through this whole locker room, is not only do they want to win, they want to make a statement. And from what I hear, even the coaches are putting that out there, that they want to make a statement. They want to run this score up. I think the biggest key is going to be really the coverage. If you can hold that coverage against these receivers and just let our edge rushers get home, then I think it's going to be hard for Michigan State to really mount any sort of an offense. Their running game is non-existent in any of their losses. Now, their wins are, you got a couple of the gimme games at the beginning of the year, and then they just obviously beat Wisconsin, which I'm still surprised by that. But I think that's going to be the biggest key, is getting to Peyton Thorne and just being able to run the ball. As long as we can run the ball and JJ can get going, I think we're going to put up a lot of points. And I'm actually recording the intro after the interview, and I think I want to change my prediction on the score. I think I'm going to say Michigan wants to put up at least 50. And I know that sounds crazy because it's the Michigan State game, but I think Michigan wants to put up at least 50, and they're going to want to shut them down. I'm going to say 51 Michigan, 17 Michigan State.
And next up, we have Graham Couch from the Lansing State Journal, and he's also co-host of the podcast, Coach and the Rube podcast. How's it going today, Graham?
Doing well. How about yourself?
And if I was any better, it'd have to be at least two of me. Well, bring you on so we can, you're one of the Michigan State experts, one of the guys, you guys talk about Michigan State football all the time. And we want to bring you on, just give us a preview of what we're going to see this Saturday. So, what's different, do you think, about this from this team this year from last year? You guys were just so dominant on the ground. So, obviously the passing defense, there was issues there, but I mean, just it doesn't feel like the same team this year as it did last year.
Yeah, no, it's quite a different group Michigan State has. I mean, they were Kenneth Walker made a massive difference in a lot of ways. And I'm not going to say it was all Kenneth Walker, but I thought without him last year, they were a 5-7 or 6-6 team. So right away, you sort of not that different than last year with now. They also had a better offensive line a year ago. They were more seasoned. They had a veteran group with about 9 guys in the playing group. It wasn't a great offensive line, but they had a number of guys who were seasoned and capable, and they were better than they are right now. And so when you factor those two things in, and then they had a more favorable schedule in terms of sort of the build up to, you remember the Michigan game a year ago was the same weekend, and they were, 8-0 headed in, or 7-0 headed in. But they had played, and they had a really impressive win at Miami, and it was a decent Miami team at the time, and they had gone down there and really taken it to Miami. But other than that, a lot of their wins had been against teams that didn't have the goods to really hurt their secondary. And as they got beat up as the year went on, that changed. And this year's been different. They played teams early that had good quarterbacks or were in a good place confidence-wise, and they had some injuries that have hurt them. So they're I've always said with Michigan State, there are sort of two parallel tracks with Mel Tucker right now, and there's the one, the here and now, which is what they're trying to do, and they're trying to win as they go along. And last year's 11-2 season was obviously a massive success in that. But the more important track, and the reason that he got the $95 million contract and all that is what they're trying to build toward and what they want to be in the future, 2025 and beyond, probably, to be fair to them. And so the real question becomes, if they stumble this year, if it continues, if things don't go well over the next month, does what's happening now affect recruiting classes and other things? If it doesn't, it's not really a big deal. But if it does, then it's a problem.
Yeah, with Mel Tucker's past, as far as, when you look at his resume, I gotta imagine he's a pretty solid recruiter. So I just feel like he's the type that he would really dig in and like, hey, it's just a 1-year blip. You got to give us a little time. I feel like he'd be able to, not only express that, but also have parents and these commits believe in him to do it. So I wouldn't be real concerned if I was a Michigan State fan, but I'm not. I don't know him as well as you would.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that he's not somebody who comes off as overly concerned by what's happening, and I think part of that is by design. Number one, he knew it was going to take a minute. He knows he doesn't have the goods right now, but also you don't want to look like things are unraveling, right? That just makes it worse. People have wanted him to change coordinators, especially on the defensive end. And, I'm not sure that what they have in Scotty Hazelton is the answer. But I'm not a huge believer in getting rid of coaches to scapegoat in season unless you really think that's a problem and you're playing for something. And I do think there's a risk in firing a coach mid-season that you're sort of admitting things have gone off the tracks, that you're sort of admitting there's some chaos, that you're sort of that things aren't as you want them. And you don't know how many recruits are tied to Hazelton and want to play for him or just don't want that appearance. And so when they're recruiting in a little bit of a different sphere than they have before, I know their overall recruiting class ranking isn't much higher than the best years under D'Antonio, but the number of 4-stars they've gotten, that's mostly because they don't have that many kids in the class overall, but the number of 4-stars they've gotten is a new thing in terms of the percentage of them too. And so they're definitely recruiting in a different sphere in terms of the types of schools they're up against, the number of kids who people are trying to flip. And that's a little bit of a different animal than Michigan State has dealt with in the past.
Yeah. Well, let's dive in a little bit into the offense. We'll start there. Now, Peyton Thorne, it does not feel like the Peyton Thorne from last year. I felt like Peyton Thorne was more confident last year. This is just the appearance. He just seemed like a cool, calm quarterback last year, and this year it just seems more inconsistent. Or is that just now? I'm just taking that from face value? What do you think?
Well, he definitely hasn't been able to elevate his game to carry Michigan State, and I wondered if he'd be able to do that. Like, is that? And so that is that's a whether he'll be able to do that is a fair question. I do think he's had a lot against him this year different than last year. One is having games where the running game just wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Having Jaden Reed out or limited was really a big deal. And you saw that last week when Reed was back against Wisconsin, just the impact that has when Reed is there and, had the game-winning touchdown pass. And he's just a real guy that a go-to guy, obviously been playing together forever. And so I think there's that element of it. And it's really hard. And he hasn't had good protection. This offensive line up until last week has not done, other than the two non-conference games against mid-majors, has not done a really good job of protecting him. Now, part of the reason there's criticism of him is that even early on against, Akron, for example, and Western Michigan, but especially against Akron, he was not that on target. He had 9 sort of missed targeted throws against Akron. And so even when they had some distinct advantages, he didn't play that well. So that's carried over. But he's been, if the Ohio State game was an example, he just, in the third quarter, was just brutal. And, and some of that going back to those games where he struggled early, like 5 of those 9 passes were to Keon Coleman, who's an exciting player, but is a young enough receiver that I'm not sure Keon was in the right places at all times. So I'm not sure all of those were on Peyton Thorne either. So yeah, in one sense, he has not taken the step where you go, oh my gosh, that guy is a bona fide dude. Like he could play in the NFL. That's a star. He can carry a team. And a lot of guys never become that. But I also think he's, I don't think he's been worse than last year. I just think the circumstances around him have been different.
Yeah, he does show the flashes. He does flash that talent of what you want to see in an NFL quarterback. But then he also has those other moments where you're like, no, you can't do that. But, you brought up the run game. And I did see Berger started off the year with a couple good games. And granted, they're, Western Michigan, Akron. But still, he looked good in those games. Now, obviously, since then, you've not been able to get the ground game going. Is that a combination of what Berger is or what he's not, or the blocking, or is it both?
There's a little of that. Like they've discovered, like Elijah Collins has been very good when they've sort of rediscovered him, and he was great going back a couple of years, right? Back to the end of the Antonio era, and he had a rough go with injuries and COVID that lingered and things like that. Berger is.
I remember when I saw him come back out in a couple of games there, I was like, wow, I didn't know he was still there.
Yeah, he's been an amazing story. He's sort of a story of not transferring, of sticking to it. He had a quote a couple of weeks ago just about like, I never felt like I didn't have a shot to play. They never discarded me, so to speak. Like the idea that, and I think it's a lesson to guys who jump in the portal, especially at that position where you can go somewhere and you're always going to be up against guys that, if you stick to it, you get your chance. And he's gotten his again. And he's been, I think, their best back at times. Berger has been okay too, and I think he was better the last week, but the line hasn't been good. And Jarek Broussard for a while looked like he was going to be a real player for them, the transfer from Colorado, and is been less impressive since, just in terms of hitting the right hole and things like that. So, they don't have Kenneth Walker, but they have good backs. Like if these two guys, these 3 guys, I should say, are playing behind Michigan's offensive line, they'd all be all Big Ten candidates. Now, are they Blake Corum? No, Blake Corum's a special back. He's an NFL back in my mind, but they're really good backs, and everybody would think they were really good backs and NFL caliber or it is they are playing in a very different circumstances. It's sort of I would equate it for people of a certain age, remembering the yards Emmitt Smith put up playing behind the Cowboys line and what Barry Sanders had to deal with the Lions, and it just. They're up against it a lot of weeks.
Yeah, a lot of those Detroit Lion lines. That was they used to like to throw lookout blocks. That's where they just let them run by, and they just turn around and yell at Scott Mitchell, "Look out! Here he comes!"
Nothing better than a lookout block.
Well, so Jaden Reed is obviously to me, I think he's your most talented player on offense, and he does not look like he's 6 feet. He looks small to me, but he's obviously a 6-foot receiver, but the way he moves, the way he fights for the ball, I'm severely impressed in Jaden Reed.
Yeah. And when he's healthy, like I think, that was one of the things that we didn't have a good feel on. And sometimes coaches, Mel Tucker is one of those people who does not reveal anything about injuries or whatever. And I think that was a bit of a mistake in some ways. And I also think so, like, I think sometimes coaches are better off really explaining on the front end what's going on with somebody, to the extent they don't look like they're making excuses, or it looks like, in hindsight, once Jane Reed fell into that bench and had that deep gash and had to have stitches and couldn't shower normal and missed the Washington game, like the idea that we would, and he was banged up a little bit in fall camp, the idea that we would think that Michigan State could win at Washington minus Jacob Slade, who was an all, Big Ten defensive tackle, minus Xavier Henderson, who clearly makes a difference at safety, and without Jaden Reed, with a fairly young receiving core, is sort of absurd given that setting and everything. But I picked him to win that game. Like, I was an idiot too. Like, we just didn't know, and we didn't realize how important he is, the trickle down on other receivers, because he takes so much attention. But I do think he is a great college receiver in the way he attacks the ball at the highest point. He is great battling in traffic, and he's got great speed. We've seen it on returns and other things. What he still has to do is, I think, sometimes get better separation a little bit. In route running, there's some things that the reason he came back was there's some things the NFL kind of told him, and I think he was a little humbled by where he thought he was going to get drafted. But he's obviously an NFL receiver. I think he'll carve out a place for himself at the next level. And we saw last week, for the first time, when he's healthy, he gives MSU a bona fide star, a bona fide guy. And they don't have enough of those. And I think when you're trying to upset teams, like, the way to beat a team like Michigan, or the way to, if you look back at sort of the Michigan State era of old, and I'm talking pre-D'Antonio, like Nick Saban teams that were, would upset somebody, but then only win 7 games or 6 games. Those teams didn't have great lines early on, but what they had was they had dudes, they had NFL guys that it really didn't matter who the opponent was. They could dominate you, and they the team that beat Ohio State, for example, in 1998 as a 4-touchdown underdog. Well, if you go back, Michigan State might have had more guys from that game play in the NFL than Ohio State did. It was like Plaxico Burress and Julian Peterson and Robert Smith, and Cedric Irvin, and on and on, Ronaldo Hill. And you go back to the team that beat Michigan a couple years earlier than that, it was like Tony Banks and Musa Mohammed and Derek Mason. Like, these guys were players, and it didn't matter. And they've had the Charles Rogers through the years and things like that. And you need those guys when you don't have a great team. Like, Michigan right now has everything you want. They have some of those guys, but you also don't need as many when your offensive line when you can win at the line of scrimmage like they are. Michigan State, you need guys who can just get it done against, no matter if it's Alabama or Akron. And Reed is one of those guys, when he's healthy, gives you a chance in certain settings to make plays. And I think we saw that last week.
Yeah, and his catch radius, I think, is fantastic. He reminds me of, do you remember Brandon Lloyd in the NFL? From he played for Denver and also San Francisco. He reminds me of,
yes, I do. Yes, yep.
He reminds me of Brandon Lloyd. I think he's a very similar player, just super athletic. And yeah, I like. Who else? Who's opposite Reed?
It's Keon Coleman, large, or second. I mean, Trey Mosley plays it's sometimes inside, but Mosley is the other top guy over there. But Keon Coleman I think is going to be an NFL wideout. He's 6'4", 190, 200 pounds, fast, athletic, can leap out of the gym. He's just like a lot of receivers when they're young, not always where he used to be, maybe.
Yeah.
But he is, and I think him not having Reed for a while, or not having Reed at full strength, really hurt him. But you saw him even in the Washington game have some moments where he's like took over in the end zone and came back for balls. He had a couple huge catches last week. He's their next big deal weapon, and I think he may have a higher NFL ceiling than Reed because of his size. But he's not there yet. Reed is a bona fide star, college level for sure.
You guys seem to have a steady stream of just getting some of these 3-star guys and turning them into NFL receivers, and it seems like that's been a steady stream for more than a decade now. So I mean,
Yeah, no, I mean they've had enough. I mean, it's been a good receiver school for a long, long time. You look at Michigan State's past, and it goes way back before they even threw the ball. You go Rison, Courtney Hawkins, um, you know, Derek Mason, Musa Muhammad both had decade-long NFL careers. Plaxico Burress, Charles Rogers, and so they've all. I mean, that goes back to like 2002, and then they've always had good. They've developed some good receivers. They have not had a lot of guys of that ilk since then, but they've had good receivers who developed, and the Aaron Burbridges and the Tony Lippett's and a number of Felton Davis, good players. But they ought to. Those, I mean, it's Michigan State, and those are diva positions. Like, I mean, in the MAC, most schools have a guy like that. Like, you ought to. It's a position kids want to play. They want to be featured. You're a Big Ten school that has had some success. There's really no excuse not to have good receivers.
Yeah. Now, over on the defensive side, you were mentioning that there's been some clamoring for a change at defensive coordinator, and you don't want to do that mid-season. Now, I think that also goes to the fact that sometimes it's not just the coordinator. Sometimes the play calling can be right. You just may not have the players, or they may just be missing too many assignments, because you can find a missed assignment on half the plays out there by, at least one or two players. They just hit the wrong gap, something. Well, do you think it's more on they don't have the right guys for that system? Do you think it is the play calling, or, where do you land on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not having the guys is a big part of it. Not having the guys healthy. I thought they had improved their depth from last year when they got hit with injuries as the season went along, and they really couldn't stand up anymore to it. But I mean, they may have improved here and there their depth, but they weren't good enough to withstand the injuries where they got them. And the programs can get to a place where you don't lose a couple of guys, and it's like, boy, because you saw it last week when Slade and Henderson came back. You're all Big Ten defensive tackle back, and you get, your fifth-year safety, and they moved to a 4-3 as well last week, and they moved their best transfer, Jacoby Winmon, to linebacker from defensive end, and that was a big success. So they did adjust finally last week. I think they should have gone to a 4-3 earlier. They should have simplified things. They should have put Winmon at linebacker. But that was made easier by having Henderson back and by having Slade up front. And so there's no doubt to me that Scotty Hazelton's defense can work. I mean, he got hired because I think Mel Tucker was intrigued by it. It worked. They had some big wins at Kansas State. People think very highly of him when he was at Wyoming. But there was not a lot of guys playing a lot of confidence in it. And I think there are simpler defenses that are better equated to more aggressively be more aggressive and more successful when you have less talent than what he's done. And you have to adjust to that. And I don't think they've done a good job of that. So, what they do at the end of the year, I don't know. Now, if there's continued positive regression, then I think things will be different. Like, people aren't upset with Scotty Hazelton this week. Last week was a really good step. People are a little upset with the offensive coordinator, but nobody's ever happy unless you're really winning. But because they did make a lot of changes. They got guys back. It was clear that injuries affected that. But then they made a sort of a radical adjustment. They changed their scheme, and they changed their best player to this point defensively. They changed his position to put him in a spot, more natural position, to put him in a spot to be able to make more plays, and it worked. Now, Wisconsin is an okay team. The week before, they bludgeoned Northwestern. They looked good against Purdue yesterday, but they're not where Michigan is. So we'll find out quickly now if that is, how much of that's real or not, and how much that matters against a Michigan team that I think is going to be fairly motivated to put one on Michigan State this year, and then we'll see beyond that. They got Illinois the week after that, which is a really turned into a really tough game that you didn't know was going to be tough at the beginning of the schedule. And then after that, they finished with more, reasonable chances to win against Rutgers and Indiana, and then Penn State, which who knows on the road. But if they're going to have a chance and be competitive in either one of these next two games, especially the Michigan game, that defense is going to have to be just those changes are going to have to make more of a difference than we ever could have realized.
Yeah, and I think Windman's going to have, a very dominant game to have some sort of effect on, JJ or Blake or Edwards, because we do have a very good offensive line. We are obviously out our right tackle right now. Our backup is a very solid right tackle, but Windman, obviously, that's going to be his spot to try and exploit an area to get more pressure on JJ to get in the backfield. So, that is one spot that could be an advantage for Michigan State in this game. Now, how about the other linebackers that he's joining up with now that he's moved back a little bit? How are they as far as like in coverage, filling the gaps for run defense, chasing down? How are they?
It is. I mean, I think they're okay at the linebacker position. I thought they looked good last week,
Mm-hmm.
but it's they don't have. I think against the run they're okay. It'll be very interesting to see in Van Summer and Cal Halliday and those guys. In pass coverage they struggle. And Windman was good there last week against tight ends, but when they get stuck in pass coverage, it's been rough. But I think they're okay against the run there. I think what's been disappointing for MSU is that minus Jacob Slade, with even what I still think is a pretty good defensive tackle group, there are they have not been stout against the run there. Like Michigan State's defense hasn't had anything it can hang its hat on until really at anything at this point, and that's been the challenge. Like it's one thing if teams are picking you apart through the pass, but people just can't run the football on you. That hasn't been there. And so we'll see if, they've got to get to the point where they do something well. The one thing that they finally did last week well, is Winmon is a guy who has a nose for the ball, and he will strip it, and he's created turnovers, and they need the only way I would put the ability to beat Michigan is they've got to win the turnover battle by 3 minimum. So things are going to have to go wrong for Michigan. And, we've seen what can happen. Obviously, when, ball gets on a defensive lineman's shoulder and boom, it goes 6 the other way. And we saw that against Penn State, and they're in the game for a little bit. Mm-hmm. They're going to need more of that. They're going to need fumbles. They're going to need picks. They're going to need to win that turnover battle by about 3, in my opinion, to really have a legitimate shot at this game.
Yeah, and there has been some talk that Van Sumeren's been a kind of a problem in coverage, that he fills the run game nice. I think he's a big solid back that can help even with a bigger back. Obviously we don't have Haskins anymore, but he's a guy that he's the type of linebacker I feel like that could handle those bigger backs a little bit. But back in coverage, you have obviously Speed and Brantley, and even Gross is probably out there a lot, considering how many pass sets there are nowadays. So, there's obviously been some difficulties in pass coverage at Michigan State, but I still feel like they're better this year than they were last year, and at least by the numbers they are. But what needs to happen? Is this another one where it's just they need to improve the talent more, or is there a problem with the scheme, or is it again just the injury bug getting those guys back?
I don't think we know. I mean, they obviously got to improve the talent. They've got to have guys who, they've got to get some corners in there who can really be a problem. They've got to, can win in press coverage, I think, and those the best of the D'Antonio teams. That was his strength, right? It was on discovering and recruiting and developing defensive backs. That staff was really good at it for a long time.
Tough ones too.
What's that?
Tough ones too. They were always just super tough.
and you knew it, and you became, D'Antonio had some issues at the end certainly, and ran out of steam a little bit, and there were some problems on offense, but you could trust him defensively when he told you that a corner was legit. Like Josiah Price was not a huge recruit, and yet no, Josiah Price, Josiah Scott. Sorry, too many Josiahs in the program. Josiah Scott, the corner who came in, and he right away compared him to Darqueze Dennard, and everybody was like, okay. And then on game one, you saw it. You're like, okay, this kid's aggressive. He's attached to people, and he was an NFL corner. And the same thing happened with guys before him, and they've got to get more of that. They need guys. They certainly need more. Mel Tucker has said, and he's coached places where they've won national titles, been in contention. He if there's one thing you can truly trust about Mel Tucker, is that he understands the talent level it takes to win at the very, very highest level. And he has said to do so, you really need 3 or 4 difference makers on both sides of the ball, like guys who are just problems for the other team, guys who are NFL dudes. Right when you look at them, right when they play, you're like, okay, that's. And Michigan State doesn't have that right now. They have, maybe one on offense and Jaden Reed when he's healthy. Okay, that's one. But then on defense, is Windman at linebacker one? Is Slade one? Yeah, okay, maybe. They're good players, guys who might play in the league, but they're not. And maybe Slade is one. But, at most they have like 1.5 to 2.5 total. And I would argue that it's not that even. And so that's what they need. They need to have more guys that you just go, how do you block that guy? I mean, think about what Michigan had on the defensive line last year. And you had guys like, how do you deal with that guy? How do you block that guy? Right. And they had 2 of them. And so that just makes everything easier for everybody else. Everybody else looks better. Your defensive backs look better when you have people who can get after the quarterback like that. The whole game gets easier. And I'm not sure right now with MSU's pass rush most of this season, if you took Darqueze Dennard and Trey Waynes, 2 guys who were first-round picks at Michigan State, lockdown receivers on, one of the better defenses to go through the Big Ten in 2013. I'm not sure that those corners would look great all the time in this MSU defense, because you can only defend back there for so long, and they haven't been able to get pressure or do anything. So there's been nothing that they can hang their hat on. And last week they did some things, and we'll see if they can do some things when the offense gets quite a bit better.
And you are exactly right when you're talking about that defensive line. When you get that pressure, that's going to make it just helps so much back in coverage, because they don't have enough time to get open. You can do so many more things as far as playing press, even though you may not be a 4-4 guy. You can play that press coverage and not worry about getting beat deep. It's just as much as like the offensive line for the pass game and the run game is important for the defensive line to get that pressure and to be able to stop the run up front with 4. Not all the time. You're obviously going to need your linebackers, but still, it just takes so much pressure off linebackers and defensive backs that way. So it's going to be a good game. It's always super emotional. And the main thing I hope for is that it's a clean game. I know that's going to be tough with the rivalry and all, but hopefully it doesn't get too bad. What's your prediction on the game if you had to give a score?
Yeah, I haven't. This may change before I write it for us, but because I could see a lot of things happening. I could see just this disastrous for MSU game, 70-7 type game where it's brutal. But I've also seen games where you expected it to be lopsided and it wasn't, or Michigan State won. For example, I have picked Michigan to win this game 7 straight years, and Michigan State's won 4 of those years. So it tells you where I've not exactly been on point. But my guess is that there's a different feel to this, right? It's a different there's a different level of venom and the way they hit, and people feel it when you're on the field. The players talk about it all the time. You got to be out there to truly understand it. And I think that does matter for a while. And I do think the game will be competitive for a while. I just think at some point what Michigan has is too much, and the dam will break a little bit. And I would put it at like right now, I would say something like 41 to 10, something like that, because I think Michigan really wants to make a point here.
And I agree. And you're talking about those games in the past where you probably picked Michigan, because there's been numerous times Michigan probably had more talent, but they always lost the mental battle. Like the Michigan State would get in their head. They wanted it more. They just flat out wanted it more.
Well,
And something happened between the 2020 and the 2021 season where leaders got together on the team. Last year's mentality was so good, and it's carried over, which I think a lot of times you lose when you lose that when you lose a Aiden Hutchinson, or one of those captains that was the vocal emotional leader for your team. And we still ended up we still ended up being able to hold on to that and to carry it over this year. And that's why I'm not as nervous about this game as I would have been in years past, where you guys did take it from us, even though we probably had a better team.
There are a couple things to note with that, and I think you are what you emphasize sometimes. And for years, this Michigan State emphasized this game, and you could see it. And when the game is not treated like an afterthought, but as not the game, it matters. It matters how 19 and 20-year-olds prepare and their mindset they're in. And so I think that has been there. But I think what's happened is when, they've won 10 times in 14 years. And I think that has changed to some degree, where it is very important now to Michigan to stop the tide of this a little bit and to win this game. I mean, you think about what's at stake for Michigan. It's not just Michigan State. It's not just Paul Bunyan. It's not just, getting people that they didn't lose to those guys again. It's how much it would ruin a season to lose, because and how much it would change the perception of everything good that's going on. If for Harbaugh, if like you lose to Michigan State again, and then you got to go to Columbus too, there's a potential for 2 losses to the teams that you struggled to beat most. Like, wait a sec, I thought this team was different. And so to me, there's so much to lose in this game for Michigan that it almost gets to a point that it's okay.
The pressure's on them.
Yeah, but you better be an emphasis. And I think when you heard them saying they were going to have 4 practices in the bye week, all focused on Michigan State, and you hear Michigan State basically saying, yeah, well, practices, they're a little different than a normal game week. The coaches are off recruiting. Like, I think it's the shoes on the other foot. And it's very interesting that the whole tide of it is turned a little bit. It's I grew up around Lansing. I mean, I remember it growing up, how Michigan was perceived, and I think Michigan State fans will always have this inferiority complex. But I think Michigan views the game differently. And I remember asking Izzo about it several years back, because he went through it where in basketball it used to be viewed much the same way, and now it wasn't as big a deal to Michigan, but it was Michigan controlled the rivalry, and then they were down for a period of time as MSU basketball was on the rise. And I asked Izzo, like, how long did it take, do you think, to flip it in the sense of changing perception, where Michigan State was an equal in the eyes of like Michigan people, or equal or better, or that's and he said, it took about 10 years in basketball. And I said, well, how long would it take in football, you think? And he said about 15. And if you look at this particular year, this is the 15th year since that initial win in 08 with D'Antonio. I mean, it's been that long of Michigan State winning fairly regularly. And I think, and even in recent years, winning at least half of the games. And so I do think you see a different mindset. Like if you go on, like on Twitter, and Twitter is not a perfect representation of anything. And nor do we have a great comparison, because if you go back to, you can't go back to 2004 Twitter. It didn't exist. You can't go back and see how the mindsets were really different.
Yeah,
I do think that the Michigan fan base is more annoyed by Michigan State, sees this more of a focal point, is in their own way more respectful of that program, even if it doesn't always show, just because of what's transpired over 14 years.
Yeah, and I agree with the emphasis part, and because they've also put more emphasis on this game, and there's obviously the Ohio State aspect that Michigan's always going to put the most emphasis on, but Michigan State is now just underneath that, and they really want this game. I'm gonna go a little bit more. I'm gonna say 38-17 Michigan in this game, but I can't wait for this Saturday. It's going to be a fantastic game. Graham, where can we find your stuff? I know you have the podcast. Can you name that podcast? And then,
yeah.
where to find you on
Couch in the
Twitter?
Rube is the podcast we record Sunday, Tuesday nights, and Thursday nights. It's a live and then podcast show. And then at LansingStateJournal.com, and also just my Twitter account is Graham_Couch, and pretty much tweet out everything I do. So
appreciate it so much for you to come on and help us out. You have a fantastic rest of your week.
You as well. Thanks so much.
It's great to be a Michigan Wolverine. It's great to be a Michigan Wolverine. It's great to be a Michigan Wolverine. It's great to be a Michigan